Welcome to today's lesson where we are going to talk about how do we go about solving absolute value equations. So in this lesson we're going to really focus on one specific type of equation, and that is an equation that has to do with absolute value. And so it makes sense to take a second and really talk a little bit about what is the absolute value of a number. So in order to do that, I wanted to give you a couple things to think about. One is I've got a couple of apples here. One is a red apple and one is a green apple. And I think that you would agree with me that both of them are apples. They're just different varieties of an apple. Now, absolute value is similar because if we think about numbers on a number line, we have a positive variety of numbers and a negative variety of numbers. And so if you're thinking about, for example, the number 6, I have a positive 6 and a negative 6. And both of them are variations of the number 6, but they're still actually 6 units from 0 on the number line. And that's really what we think about absolute value to be. Absolute value is defined to be its distance from 0. Okay, so with that in mind, can you tell me how many numbers have an absolute value of 3? Thinking about that definition, how many numbers have a distance of 3 units from 0 on the number line? Now, you should have probably said 2, and you would be right if you did. We have a positive 3 and a negative 3, and they both are 3 units from 0. Okay, so that kind of gives us a little bit of a better comprehension of what absolute value is. So, how do we go about solving absolute value equations? Well, it's not too difficult, but we need to keep in mind that since there are two numbers that have a distance of a specific value away from 0, we have to keep that in mind. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to isolate the absolute value expression so that it is in this form. The absolute value of some expression is equal to some constant c. Now notice on the left-hand side, there is only the absolute value expression. And then on the right-hand side, we have some constant. Now, this is going to be important later because remember that absolute value represents distance from 0, and distance is never negative. So it's important that when we have the equation in this form, c is not negative. All right, now, provided that c is greater than or equal to 0, we are going to rewrite the equation so that it can give us both of the correct answers. So we're going to take that expression, absolute value expression is equal to c, and separate it into two other equations. Okay, and now notice that when we separate it, the absolute value symbol is gone. Those bars have disappeared. Okay, and so we have separated into the two cases, a positive value and a negative value, that would satisfy the equation. Okay, so after we've done that, then we're going to go ahead and solve each of those equations for the variable that we're given. And then we would want to definitely go back and check our answers in the original equation. Okay, so pretty much a three-step process, for if you say that checking your answer is a separate step. And it really is. Okay, so let's try a couple of examples, 3 to be exact. Okay, so let's start with this example here. Let's solve the absolute value equation. 2 times the absolute value of 4 minus 5 halves x plus 6 is equal to 18. Okay, now remember, first thing, we want to isolate the absolute value expression. So we want to get what I've highlighted in pink here, by itself on the left-hand side. So we would employ the skills that we normally do. We would get rid of that 6 first and the 2 second. So we would subtract 6 from both sides, and that would give us 2 times the absolute value of 4 minus 5 halves x is equal to 12. And then we would divide out the 2. So we would have the absolute value of 4 minus 5 halves x is equal to 6. Now I want to make sure that the constant that I have at this point where we have the absolute value expression isolated, we want to make sure that this constant is not negative. And we're good. 6 is, of course, positive. Since that c value is greater than or equal to 0, we're going to separate this equation into 2 equations with plus and minus 6. And when we do that, we're going to drop the absolute value bars. So I have 4 minus 5 halves x is equal to 6, or 4 minus 5 halves x is equal to negative 6. Right? And so now I have 2 equations which I'm going to go ahead and solve. So let's just focus on this left-hand side for a second. If I look at this left-hand equation, the first thing I would do would be subtract 4 from both sides, right? Now, wouldn't I do the same thing over here as well? I would subtract 4 from both sides of this equation. And when I do that, I end up with negative 5 halves x is equal to 2, or negative 5 halves x is equal to negative 10 when I subtract that 4 from both sides. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is multiply both sides of this equation by the reciprocal of this coefficient. Okay, and so that's going to get rid of that coefficient. So I'm going to multiply both sides of this equation by negative 2/5, as well as both sides of this equation by negative 2/5. So let's do that. Okay, awesome. Now I want to go ahead and simplify things. When I multiply this negative 2/5 times a negative 5 halves, I get a positive 10 over 10, which is just 1, x. So I'd have x on this side is equal to negative 4/5, or x is equal to negative 10 times negative 2 over 5, which is the same as positive 4. So I have my 2 solutions, and I want to make sure that they work in the original equation. So I'm going to go back and substitute the first one, negative 4/5, in here for x. Okay, so when I substitute this negative 4/5 in here, I've got negative 5 halves times negative 4/5. So I've got positive 20 over 10, positive 2, so 4 plus 2 is 6. The absolute value of 6 is 6. Multiply that by 2 would give me 12. And then add the 6 and I would get positive 18, which does definitely work. And then trying the second one, which is a little simpler. If I take 5 halves times 4, that's 5 times 4 divided by 2, 20 over 2 is 10. 4 minus 10 is negative 6. But then I take the absolute value of that, and that's positive 6, times 2 is 12, plus 6 is 18, and that also satisfies the equation. So both of my answers work just fine. All right, let's try a different example. So for this example, no fractions, which I know some of you are relieved about, but we're going to use the same process. We are going to isolate that absolute value expression first thing. So there it is in pink. We want to subtract 6 on both sides, and that would give us a negative 4 on the right-hand side. And then we want to divide out the 3. And so when the absolute value expression is isolated, absolute value of x minus 1, I end up with negative 4/3. Okay, and so here's where we need to be careful, because we know absolute value represents a distance from 0, and that distance is always non-negative, and this is negative. Okay, so since it's negative, and that can't be true with absolute value equations, there is no solution to this particular equation. Okay, so you would just write no solution or the null symbol there. And then we've got one more example. Here we go. 5 times the absolute value of 3x minus 2 plus 7 is equal to 7. Okay, starting as we have in the past, we are going to isolate the absolute value expression by subtracting 7. And now dividing out the 5. So we end up with the absolute value of 3x minus 2 is equal to 0. So is the constant negative? No. So we can go ahead and proceed. All right, so since c is greater than or equal to 0, I can break this apart with two equations equaling plus or minus c. Oh, but wait a second. Is there such thing as negative 0? No. So that particular equation does not actually exist. This equation will have only one answer. So we're going to go ahead and solve this equation on the left side. So 3x is equal to 2 and x is equal to 2/3. We would go ahead and check that in our original equation. 3 times 2/3 is going to be 6/3, which is 2. 2 minus 2 is 0. The absolute value of 0 is 0. 5 times 0 is 0, plus 7 is equal to 7. Yay, that works out just beautifully. And that will conclude our discussion about absolute value. Hope you all have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.